Just 2 videos to go. This one and the next one. So this is video number 20 for the Ickabog. We're on chapter 57, Daisy's Plan. Up in the marshlands, where the snow still lay thick upon the ground, the Ickabog was no longer pushing the boulder in front of the cave mouth when it went out with its baskets. Instead, Daisy, Bert, Martha, and Roderick were helping it collect the little marsh mushrooms it liked to eat. And during these outings, they also prized more frozen food from the abandoned wagon, which they took back to the cave for themselves. All 4 humans were growing stronger and healthier by the day. The Ickabog, too, was growing fatter and fatter. But this was because its bonding time was drawing ever closer, as the bonding was when the Ickabog said it intended on eating the 4 humans. Bert, Martha, and Roderick weren't very happy about the Ickabog's growing belly. Bert, in particular, was certain the Ickabog meant to kill them. He now believed he'd been wrong about his father having an accident. The Ickabog was real, so clearly the Ickabog had killed Major Beamish. Often on their mushrooming trips, the Ickabog and Daisy would draw a little ahead of the others, having their own private conversation. "What do you think they're talking about?" Martha whispered to the 2 boys as they searched the bog for the small white mushrooms the Ickabog particularly liked. "I think she's trying to make friends with it," said Bert. "What, so it'll eat us instead of her?" said Roderick. "That's a horrible thing to say," said Martha sharply. Daisy looked after everyone at the orphanage. Sometimes she took punishments for other people too. Roderick was taken aback. He'd been taught by his father to expect the worst of everybody he met, and that the only way to get on in life was to be the biggest, the strongest, and the meanest in every group. It was hard to lose the habits he'd been taught. But with his father dead and his mother and brothers doubtless in prison, Roderick didn't want these 3 new friends to dislike him. "Sorry," he muttered, and Martha smiled at him. Now, as it happened, Bert was quite right. Daisy was making friends with the Ickabog, but her plan wasn't only to save herself or even her 3 friends, it was to save the whole of Cornucopia. As she and the monster walked through the bog on this particular morning, drawing ahead of the others, she noticed that a few snowdrops had managed to force their way up through a patch of melting ice. Spring was coming, which meant soldiers would soon be returning to the edge of the marsh. With a funny seasick feeling in her stomach, because she knew how important it was that she got this right, Daisy said, "Ickabog, you know the song you sing every night?" The Ickabog, who was lifting a log to see whether there were any mushrooms hiding beneath it, said, "If I didn't know it, I couldn't sing it, could I?" "Oh, a little smart aleck, Ickabog." It gave a wheezy little chuckle. "Well, you know how you sing that you want your children to be kind and wise and brave?" "Yes," agreed the Ickabog, and it picked up a small silvery gray mushroom and showed it to Daisy. "That's a good one. You don't get many silver ones on the marsh." "Lovely," said Daisy, as the Ickabog popped the mushroom into its basket. "And then, in the last chorus of your song, you say you hope that your babies will kill people," said Daisy. "Yes," forgot to be doing the deep voice. "Yes," said the Ickabog again, reaching up to pull a small bit of yellowish fungus off a dead tree and showing it to Daisy. "This is poisonous. Never eat this kind." "I won't," said Daisy, and drawing a deep breath, she said, "But do you really think a kind, wise, brave Ickabog would eat people?" The Ickabog stopped in the act of bending to pick up another silvery mushroom and peered down at Daisy. "I don't want to eat you," it said, "but I have to, or my children will die." "You said they need hope," said Daisy. "What if, when the bonding time comes, they saw their mother, or their father, I'm sorry, I don't quite know." "I will be their Icker," said the Ickabog, "and they'll be my Ickabogles." Well, then, wouldn't it be wonderful if your Ickaboggles saw their Icker surrounded by people who love it and want it to be happy and to live with them as friends? Wouldn't that fill them with more hope than anything else could do? The Ickabog sat down on a fallen tree trunk, and for a long time it said nothing at all. Bert, Martha, and Roderick stood watching from a distance. They could tell something very important was happening between Daisy and the Ickabog, although they were extremely cautious. They did not dare approach. At last, the Ickabog said, Perhaps, perhaps it would be better if I did not eat you, Daisy." This was the first time the Ickabog had called her by her name. Daisy reached out and placed her hand in the Ickabog's paw, and for a moment the two smiled at each other. Then the Ickabog said, "When my bornding comes, you and your friends must surround me, and my Ickaboggles will be bornded knowing you're their friends too. And after that, you must stay with the Ickaboggles here on the marsh forever." "Well, the problem with that is," said Daisy cautiously, still holding the Ickabog's paw, "that the food on the wagon will run out soon. I don't think there are enough mushrooms here to support the four of us and your Ickaboggles too." Daisy found it strange to be talking like this about a time when the Ickabog would not be alive, but the Ickabog didn't seem to mind. "Then what can we do?" it asked her, its big eyes anxious. "Ickabog," said Daisy cautiously, "people are dying all over Cornucopia. They're starving to death and even being murdered, all because some evil men made everyone believe you wanted to kill people." "I did want to kill people until I met you four," said the Ickabog. "But now you've changed," said Daisy. She got to her feet and faced the Ickabog, holding both of its paws. "Now you understand that people, most people anyway, are not cruel or wicked. They're mostly sad and tired, Ickabog. And if they knew you, how kind you are, how gentle, how all you eat is mushrooms, they'd understand how stupid it is to fear you. I'm sure they'd want you and your Ickaboggles to leave the marsh and go back to the meadows where your ancestors lived, where there are bigger, better mushrooms, and for your Ickaboggles to live with us as our friends." "You want me to leave the marsh," said the Ickabog, "to go among men with their guns and their spears?" "Ickabog, please listen," begged Daisy. "If your Ickaboggles are bornded, surrounded by hundreds of people, all wanting to love and protect them, wouldn't that feed them more hope than any Ickaboggle ever had in history? Whereas, if the four of us stay here on the marsh and starve to death, what hope will remain for your Ickaboggles?" The monster stared at Daisy, and Bert, Martha, and Roderick watched, wondering what on earth was happening. At last, a huge tear welled in the Ickabog's eye like a glass apple. "I'm afraid to go among them. I'm afraid they'll kill me and my Ickaboggles." "They won't," said Daisy, letting go of the Ickabog's paws and placing her hands instead on either side of the Ickabog's huge, hairy face. So her fingers were buried in its long, marsh, weedy hair. "I swear to you, Ickabog, we'll protect you. Your bornding will be the most important in history. We're going to bring Ickabogs back, and Cornucopia too." Chapter 58, Hetty Hopkins. When Daisy first told the others her plan, Bert refused to be part of it. "Protect that monster? I won't," he said fiercely. "I took a vow to kill it, Daisy. The Ickabog murdered my father." "Bert, it did not," Daisy said. "It never killed anyone. Please, listen to what it's got to say." So that night in the cave, Bert, Martha, and Roderick drew close to the Ickabog for the first time, always having been too scared before, and it told the four humans the story of the night years before when it had come face to face with the man in the fog with yellow face hair, said the Ickabog, pointing at its own upper lip. "A mustache?" suggested Daisy. "And a tinkly sword." "Jeweled," said Daisy. "It must have been the king." "And who else did you meet?" asked Bert. "Nobody," said the Ickabog. "I ran away and hid behind a boulder. Men killed all my ancestors. I was afraid." "Well, then how did my father die?" demanded Bert. "Was your Icker The one who got shot by the big gun? Asked the Ickabog. Shot? Repeated Bert, turning pale. How do you know this if you'd run away? I was looking from out behind the boulder, said the Ickabog. Ickabogs can see well in the fog. I was frightened. I wanted to see what the men were doing on the marsh. One man was shot by another man. Flapoon! Burst out Roderick at last. He'd been afraid to tell Bert before, but he couldn't hold it in any longer. Bert! I once heard my father tell my mother he owed his promotion to Lord Flapoon in his blunderbuss. I was really young. I didn't realize what he meant at the time. I'm sorry I never told you. I was afraid of what you'd say. Bert said nothing for several minutes. He was remembering that terrible night in the blue parlor when he'd found his father's cold, dead hand and pulled it from beneath the cornucopian flag for his mother to kiss. He remembered Spittleworth saying that they couldn't see his father's body, and he remembered Lord Flapoon spraying him and his mother with pie crumbs as he said how much he'd always liked Major Beamish. Bert put a hand to his chest where his father's metal lay close against his skin, turned to Daisy, and said in a low voice, "All right, I'm with you." So the four humans and the Ickabog began to put Daisy's plan into operation, acting quickly because the snow was melting fast and they feared the return of the soldiers to the marshlands. First, they took the enormous empty wooden platters that had borne the cheese, pies, and pastries they'd already eaten, and Daisy carved words into them. Next, the Ickabog helped the two boys pull the wagon out of the mud, while Martha collected as many mushrooms as she could find to keep the Ickabog well fed on the journey south. At dawn on the third day, they set out. They'd planned things very carefully. The Ickabog pulled the wagon, which was loaded up with the last of the frozen food, and with baskets of mushrooms in front of the Ickabog walked Bert and Roderick, who were each carrying a sign. Bert's read, "The Ickabog is harmless." Roderick said, "Spittleworth has lied to you." Daisy was riding on the Ickabog's shoulders. Her sign read, "The Ickabog eats only mushrooms." Martha rode in the wagon along with the food and a large bunch of snowdrops, which were part of Daisy's plan. Martha's sign read, "Up with the Ickabog, down with Lord Spittleworth." For many miles, they met nobody, but as midday approached, they came across two ragged people leading a single, very thin sheep. This tired and hungry pair were none other than Hetty Hopkins, the maid who'd had to give her children to Ma Grunter and her husband. They'd been walking the country trying to find work, but nobody had any to give them. Finding the starving sheep in the road, they'd brought it along with them. But its wool was so thin and stringy that it wasn't worth any money. When Mr. Hopkins saw the Ickabog, he fell to his knees in shock, while Hetty simply stood there with her mouth hanging open. When the strange party came close enough and the husband and wife were able to read all the signs, they thought they must have gone mad. Daisy, who had expected people to react like this, called down to them, "You aren't dreaming. This is the Ickabog, and it's kind and peaceful. It never killed anyone. In fact, it saved our lives." The Ickabog bent down carefully so that it would not dislodge Daisy and patted the thin sheep on the head. Instead of running away, it baaed, quite unafraid, then returned to eating the thin, dry grass. "You see," said Daisy, "your sheep knows it's harmless. Come with us. You can ride on our wagon." The Hopkinses were so tired and hungry that even though they were still very scared of the Ickabog, they heaved themselves up beside Martha, bringing their sheep too. Then off trundled the Ickabog, the 6 humans, and the sheep heading for Jeroboam. Chapter 59, Back to Jeroboam. Dusk was falling as the dark gray outline of Jeroboam came into view. The Ickabog's party made a brief stop on a hill overlooking the city. Martha handed the Ickabog the big bunch of snowdrops. Then everyone made sure they were holding their signs the right way up, and the 4 friends shook hands because they'd sworn to one another and to the Ickabog that they would protect it and never stand aside, even if people threatened them with guns. So down the hill toward the wine-making city the Ickabog marched, and the guards at the city gates saw it coming. They raised their guns to fire, but Daisy stood up on the Ickabog's shoulder, waving her arms, and Bert and Roderick held their signs aloft. Rifles shaking, the guards watched fearfully as the monster walked closer and closer. "The Ickabog has never killed anyone," shouted Daisy. "You've been told lies," shouted Bert. Bert. The guards didn't know what to do because they didn't want to shoot the four young people. The Ickabog shuffled ever closer, and its size and strangeness were both terrifying. But it had a kindly look in its enormous eyes and was holding snowdrops in its paw. At last, reaching the guard, the Ickabog came to a halt, bent down, and offered each of them a snowdrop. Oh, I guess snowdrops are flowers. I didn't know that. I thought they were snowdrops. The guard took the flowers because I was wondering when it said the snowdrops came up above the ice. Now it makes a lot more sense. The guards took the flowers because they were afraid not to. Then the Ickabog patted each of them gently on the head as it had done to the sheep and walked on to Jeroboam. There were screams on every side. People fled before the Ickabog or dove to find weapons, but Bert and Roderick marched resolutely in front of it, holding up their signs, and the Ickabog continued offering snowdrops to passers-by, until at last a young woman bravely took one. The Ickabog was so delighted it thanked her in its booming voice, which made more people scream, but others edged closer to the Ickabog, and soon a little crowd of people was clustered around the monster, taking snowdrops from its paw and laughing. And the Ickabog was starting to smile too. It had never expected to be cheered or thanked by people. "I told you they'd love you if they knew you." Try that again. "I told you they'd love you if they knew you," Daisy whispered in the Ickabog's ear. "Come with us," shouted Bert at the crowd. "We're marching south to see the king." And now the Jeroboams, who'd suffered so much under Spittleworth's rule, ran back to their houses to fetch torches, pitchforks, and guns, not to harm the Ickabog, but to protect it. Furious at the lies they'd been told, they clustered around the monster, and off they marched through the gathering darkness with only one short detour. Daisy insisted on stopping at the orphanage. Though the door was, of course, firmly locked and bolted, a kick from the Ickabog soon put that right. The Ickabog helped Daisy gently down, and she ran inside to fetch all the children. The little ones scrambled up into the wagon. The Hopkins twins fell into the arms of their parents, and the larger children joined the crowd, while Ma Grunter screamed and stormed and tried to call them back. Then she saw the Ickabog's huge, hairy face squinting at her through a window. And I'm happy to tell you, she passed out cold on the floor. Then the delighted Ickabog continued down the main street of Jeroboam, collecting more and more people as it went. And nobody noticed Basher John watching from a corner as the crowd passed by. Basher John, who'd been drinking in a local tavern, hadn't forgotten the bloody nose he'd received from Roderick Roach on the night the two boys stole his keys. He realized at once that if these troublemakers with their overgrown marsh monster reached the capital, anybody who'd made pots of gold from the myth of the dangerous Ickabog would be in trouble. So instead of returning to the orphanage, Basher John stole another drinker's horse from outside the tavern. Unlike the Ickabog, which was moving slowly, Basher John was soon galloping south to warn Lord Spittleworth of the danger marching on Showville. Chapter 60, Rebellion. Sometimes, I don't know how, people who live many miles apart seem to realize the time has come to act. Perhaps ideas can spread like pollen on the breeze. In any case, down in the palace dungeons, the prisoners who'd hidden knives and chisels, heavy saucepans and rolling pins beneath their mattresses, and stones in their cell walls were ready at last. At dawn on the day the Ickabog approached Kurtzburg, Captain Goodfellow and Mr. Dovetail, whose cells were opposite each other, were awake, pale, tense, and sitting on the edges of their beds because today was the day they had vowed to escape or die. Several floors above the prisoners, Lord Spittleworth too woke early, completely unaware that a prison break was brewing beneath his feet, or that a real live Ickabog was at that very moment advancing on Showville, surrounded by an ever-growing crowd of cornucopians. Spittleworth washed, dressed in his chief advisor robes, then headed out to a locked wing of the stables, which had been under guard for a week. "Stand aside," Spittleworth told the soldiers on guard. He unbolted the doors. A team of exhausted seamstresses and tailors were waiting beside the model of a monster inside the table. It was the size of a bull with leathery skin and covered in spikes. Its carved feet bore fearsome claws. Its mouth was full of fangs, and its angry eyes glowed amber in its face. The seamstresses and tailors watched fearfully as Spittleworth walked slowly around their creation. Close up, you could see the stitching, tell that the eyes were made of glass, that the spikes were really nails pushed through the leather, and that the claws and fangs were nothing but painted wood. If you prodded the beast, a trickle of sawdust ran from the seams. Nevertheless, by the dim light of the stables, it was a convincing piece of work, and the seamstresses and tailors were thankful to see Spittleworth smile. "It will do, by candlelight at least. I'll simply have to make the dear king stand well back as he looks at it. We can say the spikes and fangs are still poisonous." The workers exchanged relieved looks. They'd been working all day and all night for a week. Now at last they'd be able to go home to their families. "Ha! Soldiers," said Spittleworth, turning to the guards waiting in the courtyard, "take these people away. If you scream," he added lazily as the youngest seamstress opened her mouth to do so, "you'll be shot." While the team that had made the stuffed Ickabog was dragged away by soldiers, Spittleworth went upstairs, whistling, to the king's apartment, where he found Fred wearing silk pajamas and a hairnet over his mustache, and Flapoon tucking a napkin neatly beneath his many chins. "Good morning, your majesty," said Spittleworth with a bow. "I trust you slept well. I have a surprise for your majesty today. We may have succeeded in having one of the Ickabogs stuffed. I know your majesty was eager to see it." "Wonderful," Spittleworth said the king. "And after that, we might send it around the kingdom, what? To show the people what we're up against." "I would advise against that, sire," said Spittleworth, who feared that if anybody saw the stuffed Ickabog by daylight, they'd be sure to spot it as a fake. "We wouldn't want the common folk to panic. Your majesty is so brave that you can cope with the sight." At that moment, the doors to the king's private apartments flew open, and in ran a wild-eyed, sweaty Basher John, who'd been delayed on the road by not one, but two sets of highwaymen. After getting lost in some woods and falling off his horse while jumping a ditch, then being unable to catch it again, Basher John had not managed to reach the palace much ahead of the Ickabog. Panicking, he'd forced entry to the palace through a scullery window, and two guards had pursued him through the palace, both of them prepared to run him through with their swords. Fred let out a scream and hid behind Flapoon. Spittleworth pulled out his dagger and jumped to his feet. "There's an Ickabog," panted Basher John, falling to his knees. "A real, live Ickabog. It's coming here with thousands of people. The Ickabog is real." Naturally, Spittleworth didn't believe this story for a second. "Take him to the dungeons," he snarled at the guards, who dragged a struggling Basher John from the room and closed the doors again. "I do apologize, sire. The man will be horsewhipped, and so will the guards who let him break into the palace." But before Spittleworth could finish his sentence, two more men came bursting into the king's private apartments. These were Spittleworth's Showville spies, who had had word from the north about the Ickabog's approach. But as the king had never laid eyes on them before, he let out another terrified squeal. "My lord," panted the first spy, bowing to Spittleworth, "there's an Ickabog coming this way, and it's got a crowd with it," panted the second. "It's real." Well, of course the Ickabog's real, said Spittleworth, who could hardly say anything else with the king present. Notify the Ickabog Defense Brigade. I shall join them shortly in the courtyard, and we'll kill the beast. Spittleworth ushered the spy to the door and thrust him back into the passageway, trying to drown out their whispers of, "My lord, it's real, and the people like it, and it's on the way south, my lord. Our contacts have seen it with their own eyes." "We shall kill this monster as we've killed all the others," said Spittleworth loudly for the king's benefit, and then under his breath he added, "Go away." Spittleworth closed the door firmly on the spies and returned to the table, disturbed, but trying not to show it. Flapoon was still tucking into some Baronstown ham. He had a vague idea that Spittleworth must be behind all these people rushing in and talking about live Ickabogs, so he was not frightened in the slightest. Fred, on the other hand, was quivering from head to foot. "Imagine the monster showing itself in daylight, Spittleworth," he whimpered. "I thought it could only come out at night." "Yes, it's getting far too bold, isn't it, your majesty," said Spittleworth. He had no idea what this so-called real Ickabog could be. The only thing he could imagine was that some common folk had rigged up some kind of fake monster, possibly to steal food or force gold out of their neighbors. But would it still have to be stopped? Of course. There was only one true Ickabog, and that was the one Spittleworth had invented. "Come, Flapoon, we must prevent this beast from entering Showville." Showville. "You're so brave, Spittleworth," said King Fred in a broken voice. "Tish pish, your majesty," said Spittleworth. "I would lay down my life for cornucopia. You should know that by now." Spittleworth's hand was on the door handle when yet more running footsteps, this time accompanied by shouting and clanging, shattered the peace. Startled, Spittleworth opened the door to see what was going on. A group of ragged prisoners was running toward him. At the head of them was the white-haired Mr. Dovetail, who held an axe, and burly Captain Goodfellow, who carried a gun, clearly wrestled from the hands of a palace guard. Right behind them came Mrs. Beamish, her hair flying behind her as she brandished an enormous saucepan, and hot on her heels came Millicent, Lady Islanda's maid, who held a rolling pin. Just in time, Spittleworth slammed and bolted the door. Within seconds, Mr. Dovetail's axe had smashed the door. "Flapoon, come!" shouted Spittleworth, and the two lords ran across the room to another door. Oh, no, it would be more like this. "Flapoon, come!" shouted Spittleworth, and the two lords ran across the room to another door, which led to a staircase down to the courtyard. Fred, who had no idea what was going on, who'd never even realized that there were 50 people trapped in the dungeons of his palace, was slow to react. Seeing the faces of the furious prisoners appear at the hole Mr. Dovetail had hacked in the door, he jumped up to follow the two lords, but they, interested in only their own two skins, had bolted the door they had escaped through from the other side. King Fred was left standing in his pajamas with his back to the wall, watching the escaped prisoners hack their way into his room. This is where I will stop. This is kind of a longer one. The next one will be a little bit longer too, but you got plenty of time to listen. Chapter 61 is next, and the next one is the final video.